So you've got a range of questions to run through?
Yeah. We can show our question, but it's not the order of our asked question, but it's it have some information about your company, and we want to have a deep understanding about the architect.
About the professional practice and yep.
And this is our first year of our master courses, and we are the international student, so we have some question about the Australian architect this area.
Yeah, let me just get an overview of this first.
We saw some interesting video in your Facebook, the public Facebook, and
so people being pushed around on a sack truck?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We think that is a relaxing atmosphere. So maybe your company is a lovely like a home or some other kind company.
Yeah, we're I guess a very family-based company. Cool. I'll let you guys determine what questions you want to prioritize or what order you want to tackle them in. And what do you need to produce out of this? Do you need to write an essay or
make a presentation?
Right. So you just as a group?
Yeah.
Right.
And also do a portfolio about this.
Oh yeah, like a profile about us. I'll wait till you're ready.
Thank you.
Do you want me to start with an overview, or do you want to pick a question to start with?
Yeah, and it could start. And good morning, Mr. Matthews.
Good morning.
Yeah, and we have some question about your company, and the first one is what is the design conception and the style of your company?
We actually consciously strive to not have a company style. One of the reasons for that is a personal belief that I don't think style comes from a company, I think style comes from an individual. And I think anytime you try to make the company have a style, it has to be driven by an individual. And you can't essentially get a corporation or a collective to all head in the same direction.
Yeah.
But what you can do is have an individual who has a strong sense of style and everyone follows that sense of style. But we've tried to avoid becoming one of those companies where there is one designer who sets the style and everyone has to follow that. Instead, we encourage every architect here to develop their own style. Because any architect here could become the architect that other architects are inspired by and follow for a while. But likewise, you want the opportunity for the company to be able to change styles over a period of time. The companies that sort of dig themselves very deeply into one style tend to have someone the name on the door, like us, where that is the person who dictates style. Like Foster and Partners, for example, there is Norman Foster's style, and that is all there will ever be. But it makes it tough at the end of that legacy to change into something new, or if that style goes out of fashion, suddenly you are less popular.
And about this one, is the style is depend on the designer, or how about your user, like the customer?
Yeah, very much so. I think that's another reason why I think a practice needs to have more than one style within it. So each individual has a style. Because we will match the architect to the client, rather than saying, well, all of our architects design in the same style, so if you don't like us, you have to go to another company. We say, well, that architect is more suited towards, slick commercial, but if you're looking for a quite rich house, this architect might do a better job. So within the company, we match the architect to the client. A lot of that has to do with personality. Rather than design aesthetic, It's 90% are they going to get along and work well together, and the other 10% is will they like each other's style. Because if they can't work well together, then there's essentially no point in the style working.
And about a personal question, what did you feel about when you take over this company? Is you just graduate the university, or?
No, I left university and then worked here for about 7 years.
Yeah.
Became an associate here when I was still quite young, and then left and went to England and worked there for a while for a different company, and then eventually the directors here, who I'm related to obviously, were talking to me and asked would I be interested in coming back here and working in the company again. So when I came back, I became a director and then progressively bought the company.
Oh, it means that you take over this company when you work about 7 years.
No, at 7 years I left the company.
Yeah.
Then came back after 2 years. So it was about 9 years after I first started with the company. Then I started buying the company and became a director about 13 years after I had originally started with the company.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time to acquire all of the skills to run an architecture practice.
And in that period, have some interesting about your company or your change?
I've changed a lot since I became a director. When I became director, it was quite an old-fashioned company, and I tried not to lose a lot of that approach.
Yeah.
But for example, we didn't have a website. We, I guess, still worked in a relatively traditional format.
Yeah.
The staff that we had in the company were generally very experienced, but a lot of them were close to retirement. The types of clients that we worked with had stayed pretty constant for a long period of time, so we've worked pretty hard to try and broaden and expand that.
Yeah.
And we probably focused a lot more on commercial projects than we previously did.
Oh, commercial project. Yeah. And this is my member.
How about we talk about the working mode of our company? And we are just curious about how did you get the project and how did you distribute the task for each individuals, and
The question about how does an architecture firm or how does our firm get our projects is usually the greatest mystery for every architect throughout their whole career. How do you get a client? And every architecture firm sort of approaches it slightly differently, but I guess the fundamental common ground is every architecture project gets their clients through relationships. If people don't know you on a personal level, they're unlikely to want to work with you as an architect, because they're committing to spend a lot of money on your services, and they're committing to working with you for a very long period of time, years usually. They've got to have a sense before they hire you that they are going to want to work with you for years. So building those professional relationships with potential clients and future clients is something that you have to start as early as possible in your career. Even as a student, it's not too early to start building the types of relationships that 20 years from now will start to result in people seeking you out as an architect. And that's true of every practice, but if you look at most practices in Australia, and it's probably true around the world, typically 90% of the work for the company comes because of the relationships of one or two people at the senior level of the company. So if your aspiration as an architect is to be sought out as a designer, if you want people to come and find you, then you need to be one of those people in the company that is so noted and so respected that it's not all about you going out and trying to build relationships. Most architects never get there. So very few architects, other than very famous architects, ever get there. And there is a drawback to being a famous architect. Well, there's several. One is that you are embedded in your style. People are coming to you because of that style. If you want to take a different direction, you're probably going to lose your customers and clients. For example, if you know Glenn Murcutt, Australian architect, he does a lot of work in steel and like interesting forms. If he suddenly went in a different direction and started working with concrete and glass, a lot of his clients would say, that's not what I like. I like what he was doing in steel. So that's one downside of becoming, building a career based on being famous. The benefit of building your career based on relationships is that if you're trying to do something really interesting in terms of design, it tends to come down to how much your client trusts you, and how much they believe in you as a designer, but also as a sensible person. And the other part of your question was about how do we work when we get the projects. And so we get the projects through relationships. That tends to mean that whoever that client chose in terms of their architect, it's very important that that relationship continues through the whole project. So it for example, doesn't work very well if an architect in our firm has a great relationship with the client. That client approaches us to work on a project and we put someone else in there, because it's that relationship that the client was interested in. So we try and maintain continuity through all of our projects. It's easier said than done, but the idea is that the architect that initially talks to a client about what are you trying to achieve, what do you want, is the same architect that develops the concept, and the same architect then carries it through and develops that concept, and the same architect then produces construction drawings, and the same architect then arranges the procurement and administers a construction contract and follows it all the way through construction and delivers the finished building. And the skill sets that you need as an architect to do that from the very start to the very finish typically take at least 10 years to develop after you've graduated. So from the point that you've graduated, you've got about at least 10 years. Some architects take 20 years to get there. 10 years of things that you're going to need to learn and skills you're going to accumulate before you can take a project from the very start to the very finish. And to give you an idea, this is a typical process chart for a project. This isn't based on a specific project, but it's essentially a step-by-step of this is everything that needs to happen to the point that you have finished all of your services on a project. So brief development, before that is all of that relationship building, getting to know them, letting them get to know you to the point where they've decided they want you to be their architect. So I'm not really even talking about structuring a fee proposal or figuring out what they need, or I'm assuming that at that point they've hired you. So at that point you're developing the brief, then concept options, then maybe cost value studies, then concept selection, then initial sketch design. Now it's really initial sketch design is 90% of what they're teaching you at university. But that means like cost value studies is not really something you're taught at university, typically. Brief development, again, it's a bit tough to teach that at university without a real client. Concept options you'll teach at university in terms of you're kind of with multiple options, and so it's really a few of these early steps that you're learning at university. How to finish a sketch design, then planning processes, getting approvals, then design development, cost value, refinement, material selection, construction documentation. We put competitive tendering, but that doesn't necessarily mean just tendering. Could be other forms of procurement. choosing a builder, then administering a construction contract, then reaching practical completion and all of the duties an architect has at that point. Then while the building is being used for its first period of time and dealing with the defects, and then the final completion and handover. So to accumulate all of the skills you need to successfully deliver each of those steps, that's what I'm saying takes about 10 years. Which is reasonably fortunate because it takes most architects about 10 years to develop the types of relationships where someone's going to put you in that position anyway. But it does mean that the learning process that you go through at university, what they're really focusing on is teaching you a few of these, like concepts and sketch design, and they'll touch on design development and they might touch on construction documentation, but things like construction documentation can take 5 years to even start to feel like you know what you're doing. So the relationships that you start building that eventually deliver your project, the idea in our practice is that the one architect that starts the project should be leading this project through the whole phase. That's a bit unusual. A lot of practices, in fact most practices worldwide, would have one architect who's got the relationship. They keep that relationship going, but then a different architect comes up with the concepts, then a different architect produces the visualizations of those concepts, and then that gets handed back to the relationship manager, and then maybe a different architect works on the procedural planning part of it, then another architect works on design development and construction documentation, and then another architect works on contract delivery, as in the building of the building. But that can mean that on not even a very big or complicated job, you could have 5 architects handing it from one to the next to the next. So if you're the concept designer and you've come up with this great idea at the start of the project, and your concept design then got handed to the guy who has the relationship, and then it got passed to the guy who's going to develop that idea and get the approvals, and another one who's going to do construction drawings, and then another architect who's going to do the administration of the contract, all of them will have to make design decisions. All of them is responsible for your initial concept, and the chances of something being not quite what you imagined is pretty high. So the best way that I've ever seen in terms of delivering really good design that stays good the whole way through, and is sort of everything is built around the same concept, is for the same architect to follow it the whole way through. But it does mean instead of the type of career path in a lot of practices where you'll either move into a sort of management role and your job is relationships and people, or you'll move into a technical role and your job is documentation and drawings, or you'll move into a contract admin role and your responsibility is on-site construction coordination with the builder, or your role is design and your job is to come up with concepts. Most practices will ask people to head into one stream or the other, because within one stream you can develop, if you just wanted to learn about documentation and construction, within 5 years you could get to the point where you really do know what you're doing. Yeah. But then there's another 4 areas of your professional skills that you're not going to develop. So we encourage everyone here to develop the full complement of professional skills, and that tends to take longer. So give you an idea of how we work?
Yeah, it's a very big story about how operation of your company. Just a quick question about, you mean during the 10 years experience to learn how to practice the whole process, and I'm just curious about, is there, you mean every individuals could play the leading role in the process, or they have a potential possibility?
Here we're only really not every company works this way, but the way we work is that every architect here should have the potential to lead a project from start to finish, including the relationship with the client, which means that we try to give every architect the opportunity to build those relationships, because the relationship, obviously if you don't have the relationship, getting through this stuff is really difficult. Like trying to persuade a client that doesn't know you and doesn't trust you to spend millions of dollars on your idea is a big ask. So letting architects build those relationships is the first step. So while they're doing that and they're building their own professional relationships, they're assisting other architects on each of these steps, and that teaches them more about each process. So the first 5 years of your career, you're assisting people, and your job is to learn as fast as you can. And then the next 5 years, your job is to start doing it with other people supporting you and helping you and making sure that you know what you're doing. And then eventually, when you're about 10 years into your career, it's your job to stand on your own 2 feet and deliver them. And then a few years after that, it's actually your job to teach other people and get other people learning while they're going through that process. It's not a coincidence that most architects do their best work when they're sort of 55 to 65 years old. The reason is it takes that long to accumulate all of the skills necessary.
During the design process, is there any urgent problem, or is there any relationship that you have to deal with government or some
other company?
Other companies to cooperate
with? We don't do a lot of work for government, and in Australia the government is typically has 2 roles. One is client and one is authority. So at a local government level, they provide planning approval, unless the project is actually a government project, in which case that's provided at a state government level. So is your question more about what relationships we have between us and government, or us and other companies, or?
I mean, something
like the builder or some other
government, some other influence your design, because for example, this building is we wanna maybe 2 meters or 20 meters, but there's some rules or some laws restrict that. So how did you deal with this situation?
That's another reason that it takes a long time before you reach the point where you are the architect responsible to that client. That you've got to have a good handle on how do the processes work. And for a typical building, let's say in the city, depending on the site, but almost every site this will apply to, there's the local council, and you've got to have an understanding of their policies. So they have a published book, which is the development plan for the City of Adelaide. And each council has their own book, and you've got to know where to find the requirements for the site you've got. So typically when a client comes to you with a site, you find out what council district they're in. You look up in the development plan what the restrictions and requirements are for that site, and it will include things like what types of use is allowed on that site. Like, can you build a factory? Can you build an apartment building? Can you build a stable for horses? It'll tell you what you can build, and it will tell you what you can't build, and there'll be a grey area in between. It will also give you the physical constraints. So it might say we want a certain percentage of the site left open as gardens or landscaping, or we want all of the buildings to be below a certain height or above a certain height. There are policies that say your building must be a minimum of this height. There'll also be policies in terms of architectural treatment. A lot of planning guidelines tend to include elements of urban design, where they might say it must be in keeping with the buildings around it, or must have similar setbacks, or must, there'll be all of these requirements. The local councils also control heritage listed items, so there'll be either on your side or sites nearby, there might be buildings that are heritage listed, and they have specific protections around them. And for example, one building might say you can demolish the whole thing except for the front door, or another might say you can change everything except the windows, and another building might say you can't change anything. So they're building specific. Beyond that, there's also controlled trees. So a tree can be protected, and you can be prevented from being able to cut down a tree. So that's the planning guidelines side of things. If the project's big enough, it's administered by the state government instead of the local government, and the processes around that are in the process of changing right now. Over the next few years, the processes in South Australia are going to change. Not drastically, just a little bit. So there's the policy side of things. The other side of things is the compliance side of things, so building rules. Now in Australia, that's dictated by something called the National Construction Code. Are you familiar with that at all, or the BCA?
Yeah. Okay.
So the BCA.
No idea about that.
Yeah, so the BCA and the National Construction Code are essentially the same thing. It's a set of minimum requirements for buildings to meet acceptable standards in terms of fire safety, environmental performance, acoustic performance, access, egress. It's basically, if you're going to build a building in Australia, it has to comply with this code. Yeah. So that means if you're going to design a building in Australia, understanding that code is really important. It can make the difference between projects working and not working. So being a competent designer or sketch designer really requires that you understand which parts of that code you have to figure out at sketch design stage, because some of them, if you don't solve them here, you can't solve them later. You certainly can't solve them when you're on site. But there's a lot in it. It's a reasonably thick book, and achieving compliance with it takes training and skill. So that's planning, then compliance and building rules, consent. In terms of working with other companies like builders, we have professional relationships with lots of building companies and lots of engineering companies, and the reason for that is different builders are good at different types of projects, but they're also better suited to different scales of projects. So a really huge building company is not going to be great at doing a really small project. They'll be expensive, they won't be suited to it, whereas a really small company is also not going to be suited to delivering a massive project. And so because we do a range of project types and scales, we need to know a range of builders. And that really happens over time, that you work with a builder and you make a judgment about, would I want one of my clients to work with them again? Would they suit this type of client or that type of client? That tends to be a judgment that a client will ultimately make, but an architect will have to advise them and provide advice like, well, I've worked with this builder before and this is what happened, I worked with this builder before and this is what happened, and then it's generally a client's decision as to who do they think the right builders for them are. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I have a question about if you have a new material and you didn't use before, and your customer is want to use that, and you and some company, your corporation company didn't have this material. How do you
feel
feel? Yeah.
these things?
The first step is to figure out if the material complies with the BCA, with the construction code. Depending on what the material is used for and depending on where you're using it. For example, the carpet that you put down in a hospital has to meet certain requirements in terms of how flammable it is and things like that. If it's an insulative external wall element, then it has to meet certain performances. Sitting separately to the Building Code of Australia is a set of Australian standards.
Which is Australian standard?
Each of them is a document, and each document covers a particular topic. Some of them are referenced in the Building Code of Australia. So, for example, if you're talking about a brick, the BCA will talk about the requirements of masonry construction and when you can use it, when you can't use it. But there's a separate masonry code, which is an Australian standard, which dictates how brick units have to be built, what performance requirements they have to have, and how they have to be laid and stacked, and how the grout should be made. And basically to make sure that whoever's actually building the brick wall has a minimum standard that they can look at and say, well, here's how I have to do it. You can do better than that, but you can't do worse than that. But the Australian standards are not all legal requirements. Some of them are recommendations for designers. So new products quite often fall in the category of, it's not a legal requirement to have to use that product or a product of that type. There's an alternative. And it usually comes down to an architect having to do a bit of research to figure out, is the product suitable? In a way, you are staking your reputation on it. And you are taking some responsibility if you detail a building and design it and document for a particular material to be used in a building. And there's a few ways that architects can get extra expertise involved. One is performance specifying. So instead of specifying that exact material and saying it must come from this company who make this product, what you can do is specify the builder is to provide a material that looks like this and has these performance characteristics. Like it might have this dimension, this density, this, and then he can go to any company he likes.
You need to keep balance to each company. And about the eco-friendly material, the government or your company will focus on this point?
We would do to the extent that our clients allow. And it's an interesting dynamic that you get, that when the economy is going really well, a lot of companies and particularly the government will start saying, we want to invest more in eco-friendly solutions and we want environmentally responsible design, we want sustainability. And then when the economy gets in trouble, everyone stops talking about it. The BCA covers a minimum standard, so nothing can fall below that in terms of insulation, solar performance. One of the biggest influences I think architects can have is finding ways to integrate passive environmental design principles that are inherent in the building. The reason for that is if you're trying to make your building more environmentally friendly by sticking a wind turbine on the top of it, and the project's going along smoothly, it'll reach a point where there's financial pressure on the project. Assuming you can even get permission to put a big windmill on top of your project, and maybe you can't because aeroplanes fly over it, but assuming you physically put it up there, at some point there'll be financial pressure of, is it a good investment to put it up there? And at that point, if it gets deleted, suddenly your building's not very environmentally friendly at all. But instead of putting a big windmill and generating your power on site, if you design the building so that its orientation is carefully thought about, it's the sort of microclimate that you create around it, the cross ventilation, the aspect in terms of glazing, if you can design it to require less power, then that's not going to be designed out of it. No one's going to say, well, we don't want south-facing windows anymore, so we're going to delete them. Let's have west-facing windows. It's far less likely to happen. So it usually is a more reliable and better outcome for architects to focus on designing buildings that require less energy rather than finding ways to generate energy. Scientists and engineers can find all sorts of ways to generate energy, but if you can design a building that requires less of it, then I think you can have a bigger environmental impact as an architect. In terms of material selection, it really comes down to research. But there was a really good article, and I don't remember who wrote it, about paper versus plastic. About if you're going grocery shopping and you've got the choice between, do I buy a paper bag to put all this in, or do I buy a plastic bag to put all this in? And you give and they cost the same amount of money. Most people would say, well, I'll buy the paper bag, that's more environmentally responsible. In actual fact, it's not. The process of making the paper, even if it's recyclable, and even if it is recycled paper, the energy embodied in that, the water used in making that far exceeds the plastic bag. And it's more to do with if you're choosing a material, the question is, what does the material need to do? Not what is the material, what is the embodied energy and what's it made of.
Focus on the function of this material
or
this building.
You need to understand its function to choose the material that is the most environmentally responsible.
Did you use the bamboo before to build a house or?
We've not used it for structure here.
For decoration.
Yeah, we've only used it for finishes, so flooring and things like that. And I think a lot of that is to do with availability. But the more architects go and find unusual materials, the more they become available. And things like cross-laminated timber is only now just becoming available as a building product in Australia. And there are projects being built in Adelaide now where the panels are coming from Europe, which is not very environmentally responsible, but it starts a trend towards that material, and then there'll be companies that open up and start making it here. So at the moment there's not many companies that, for example, make structural bamboo products in Australia. I'm not sure I can think of any. But finding new materials, particularly renewable materials, is a good way forward. But again, the question has to be about use. So if someone said, I want you to design a building that has to last for 500 years, there's going to be parts of it that you might build out of bamboo, but you're going to replace those parts of it every 10 years or so. And there's going to be other parts that you would build out of stone. Probably not even concrete, because modern concrete doesn't last 500 years. You have to go back like several.
To update.
So it's a question of, if it's the same when you have a car. There are parts of your car that are supposed to last for decades, and there are parts like the oil filter that's only supposed to last 6 months. And it's the same with a building. You've got to figure out, okay, if I want the superstructure of the building and certainly the foundations of the building to last 1,000 years, you're probably not going to build them out of plastic.
It's a long time.
Time frames for buildings have changed a lot. And I think that's one of the biggest things that architects aren't talking about, but are struggling with over the last 100 years. That if you look back 500 years ago, the architects that were designing buildings, typically the intention was for those buildings to last many generations. So it's a family home, or it's a warehouse that's going to be passed down through 3 or 4 generations and will be changed. But it's essentially things that are built to last, whereas now even a modern office building in the city, there's also a disagreement about what the economic life of an office building is. But I've heard some quantity surveyors say that, oh, it's really 20 years. I've heard others say, well, no, it's probably 70 years, but no one's saying it's 500 years. Everyone's saying, well, it's one lifetime, basically. It's just either a short lifetime or a long lifetime.
Before the conversation, we see lots of fabulous projects on your lobby. And we're just curious about which ones you're
Favorite.
so proud of.
Yeah. You could choose a personal one or the team.
There is a house that I did that I'm personally very proud of. I don't know that I would be comfortable ever saying I have done my best work already, because again, I think most architects do their best work when they're 55 to 65, and I'm not quite that old yet. So I still intend to keep doing better and better work. But there are projects that I've finished where I'll look at aspects of it and think that I'm never going to not like that. I just love the way that was done. There are projects that I consider to be great achievements of our practice, and I think they're probably less for aesthetic reasons than functional reasons. Projects that change the way the user worked. For example, the CMI Toyota building that we did on West Terrace, it sort of brought the service department that was sort of hidden in the back shed right up to West Terrace, and you can see everything going up and down on hoists. And it sort of created this big, open, transparent feel internally. So it changed the way that company approached their business. And they couldn't have changed it without that building. And those are the types of projects that I find the most interesting, where the architecture changed the client in some way.
It's like create a new feeling to the user.
Yeah. And I think it goes beyond just the feeling. It goes into a new way of doing things.
Oh, yeah.
Another project we finished recently was a middle school for St. Peter's College.
Yeah.
And again, that changed, just having that facility in the configuration that we designed changed the way they teach middle school.
Like guide the customer and how to use the building and...
Yeah, well, it's a two-way street too, because it's on those projects, the design is clearly a collaboration of ideas between what the client wants to achieve and what the architect can help them imagine and move towards. Those projects I tend to find the most interesting and the most rewarding.
Oh, yeah.
And there's other projects that I like aesthetically, but it's an office building. It didn't change the way people work.
Yeah,
fundamentally, people still go to work in an office, and
it depends on them.
Yeah, I like the projects that changed something. Where before it was like this, and afterwards it's never going to be the same again.
So the building is ever new.
So do you think the CMA building is the turning point of your company, or just for your personal career? Because I see there is not only the Toyota and the Lexus, it's also
if you do one project well in a particular type, people tend to hear about it and then seek you out for other buildings of that type. And it's the same whether it's hospitals or schools or showrooms or retail or apartment buildings. If you do one thing well, people want you to do more of it. And there's no downside to that, as long as it doesn't make you lazy in terms of, well, I've done an apartment building before, someone wants another apartment building, I've got this idea, I'll use that idea again. As soon as you stop looking for that new idea, to me it's not as inspiring. So every car dealership we've done, and we've done a few of them now, everyone reimagines the problem and reimagines the way it should work for that specific client on that specific site. And So they're just not generic. For example, you couldn't use the BMW showroom to sell Toyotas. It's a completely different approach to the business. That's as much about the brand and that customer or that client of ours as it is our architectural response. And I think architects that tend to specialize and just do one project type, after a while they tend to have used up their best ideas, and it gets harder and harder to come up with a reimagination within that type. So we try to make sure that we're working across lots of different project types at any one moment, because it's the ideas from one type that give you strange ideas about another. If you're working on an apartment building and at the same time you're doing a prison, and if you're working on a restaurant at the same time that you're doing someone's corporate headquarters, each one sort of gives you ideas and different ways of thinking that you don't get if all you ever do is one thing. So I think in terms of projects for our company, there have been several, I don't know if I'd say turning points, but milestones. There have been several projects that sort of stand out as being important projects for our office. CMI was certainly one of them. St Peter's College is definitely another. Ashford Hospital was certainly one back when we built that. And there's projects in Queensland that we've finished that are, I guess, took us into different types as well. So there's more than one.
Yeah, that's right. Is our partner have other questions?
How long will a project take? For example, if you design a house, how long will it take it? And before you design it, you need to do something to prepare for the designing. And what do you prepare for that?
Answer the time frame first. So the longest I've ever worked on one house was 7 years. And the shortest I've ever worked on one house was 1.5 years. From the initial meeting to the finished construction. Not all of that has to do with how big or complex it is. Some of it's to do with processes. So the one that took 7 years didn't strictly comply with the planning requirements, so got refused planning consent. But the client really liked the design, so they challenged that, and that then takes a long time. So that took over 1 year, and then eventually won it, and then you go through a detailed design process, and there were all sorts of challenges along the way for that project, which is why it takes 7 years. But the design, as in the actual look and concept of the house, was finished probably within the first 6 months and didn't really change at all from that point. From that point, it's a process of, okay, now let's get it built, and it just took that long. That's very rare. That will probably never happen again in my career. It's more usual if you're doing a project roughly the scale of a house, that it might take roughly 2 years from the start to the finish, typically. So you might spend 6 months working on the concept design with the client and building it up and refining it, and then you might spend, and during that time getting a planning approval hopefully, and then you might spend 6 months doing design development and construction drawings, and then 1 year building it. Something like that. What was the other part of your question?
I think you all answered my question. And for another question, it's just talking. In your company, there is some architect focus on the structure. Someone focus on the sketch. Is that?
No, we ask everyone to focus on each of them.
I mean, when you have a project and in a team, one person will focus on the design and someone others will focus on the structure?
No.
No? So
No.
everyone will focus on the...
The lead architect has to
Yeah.
focus on everything.
Oh.
So the same architect whose design it is has to resolve their own structure. They'll have team members helping them and supporting them because there's a lot to do. But the lead architect on the project is responsible for everything.
So there is no other major to take part in this project.
There's external consultants, so we'll have a structural engineer.
Yeah. Oh, still have the
Yep.
structural engineer. So if you have some different idea, for example, structure engineer think the structure is not good or they can't do that, how do you communicate with them?
The more experience you've got, the easier it is. But the first step is you've got to understand their constraints and their requirements. It takes experience to be able to have a dialogue with the structural engineer and to be able to challenge them. So if you come up with an idea for your building, there's like a sketch concept, typically you'll do that before there's an engineer involved. And then at the point that you go out and you find an engineer to work with you on the project, they'll look over your design, they'll come up with a way they think they could get the structure to work, and sometimes they will come back and say, right here there's a problem, I can't get this beam to connect to that because of, I need more ceiling space, or they'll come back and they'll find things that are a challenge about. And the better you are as an architect, the more you're able to turn that into an actual conversation where you understand why they need that space, and instead of just saying, oh okay, I'll drop my ceiling, you can say, well, what if instead of spanning this way you span that way? What if I move that column to there? It becomes a discussion, and that tends to deliver better architectural outcomes than just accepting what your engineer says, because the engineer's job is to make it stand up. They don't necessarily have the time or the training to understand what you're trying to achieve in terms of the space. So part of it is explaining to them what you're trying to achieve, and part of it is making sure that you understand what they need to achieve. And it's the second part that most architects fail at. Most architects are very interested in getting the engineer to understand your design, but not very interested in making sure you understand their design. But in the end, it's the one building, so it's actually the one design.
And do you have some project from the overseas? Because I saw in Australia there is not a lot of project here.
You mean our company?
Yeah.
We've done quite a lot of work in China before, in Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. It was quite a while ago. That we probably did our last project. Would have been 15 years ago that we finished the last one over there. Since then it's been almost entirely Australia. Mostly South Australia, some work in Queensland.
So how do?
Are those projects reach the expectation of clients?
The ones in China, I think the clients were very satisfied. What we discovered, I guess, we worked in China for about 10 years, and we worked in partnership with a design institute, with actually two different design institutes. And while the projects were great experience, and while I think the design outcomes were really good, we discovered that making it viable as a business for an Australian company is actually not that easy. And it's even harder now, which is why we essentially decided it's probably not. We essentially do better by focusing on an Australian market than by trying to be completely international. Now, almost every large firm in the world is trying to find the next big project in China, and while there are a huge number of projects and potential projects for architects in China, there's also a huge number of architects trying to win them, and I think a lot of European companies and a lot of Australian companies sort of went to China very naively, thinking that we're these brilliantly educated European architects, and we will come in and we will design brilliant architecture, and completely underestimated how much talent there is in China. That when we were working there 15 years ago, there were design institutes that were partnering with us to get us to help train them. And working with them for 10 years, they learned everything. So after that, they don't need us anymore. So there is a sense in which I think every ambitious architectural firm goes chasing projects in China or India or Indonesia, or goes looking for a different market, and they go there thinking that it's going to be great fees and easy work, rather than going there looking for interesting projects and good people to work with. So we don't consciously say, well, we are just Adelaide. We still try and work nationally, and I guess we still have some relationships in China, but it just sort of works out that us providing all of those services to China is not really of benefit to most of the clients there. But one small aspect of design development or concept development is helpful.
And the different thinking about between the Australian architect and the Asia architect, and the different thinking, maybe if you have a employee is from other country, and in your team, and how to balance the thinking and the idea?
Well, internally, we've always had a pretty diverse team. So we've got a Japanese architect, a Belgian architect, Bulgarian architect, not Belgian. We've over the years had a lot of different backgrounds within our office.
Yeah.
And I think architects tend to speak a common language. Like when architects work together, you find a way to sort of to communicate. It's more that beyond design, architects can work quite well internationally together. So like us working with our Chinese design partners, that always worked quite well. It's the cultural difference between the architect and the client that is, I think, the bigger challenge in terms of business culture. Because the business culture between the differences between China and Japan, or Japan and Australia, or England and Australia, there's cultural differences there that you have to be aware of if you're going to. It almost doesn't matter whether you selling car tires or providing architectural services. You have to understand the difference in business culture. And is that what your question was about?
And what requirement and expectation do you have to your future employer, or did you have find some international student to have an internship, or some other country student and work in your company?
I think there's a tendency for recent graduates, and particularly international students, which I guess applies to everyone. There's a tendency, I think, particularly for international students, to try and find your first role based on the strength of your graphics and your skills in Photoshop and SketchUp and rendering and producing imagery. And while that might get you your first opportunity, in terms of graduates, I only hire based on 2 criteria, and it's got nothing to do with how good your graphics are. The first one is intellect, as in how smart are you? And ideally, are you smarter than me? Because preferably you should be. The other is attitude. How interested or enthused or engaged are you? Now, there's such a thing as being too enthusiastic, because then you're going to spend the next 10 years accumulating skills. If you work yourself to death in the first week, you're not going to make 10 years. So you've got to have stamina, and you've got to have the kind of interest in architecture and in your profession and all of these skills that you can sustain for 10 years while you learn it all.
Maybe a whole life.
That's exactly right. You shouldn't ever plan to stop getting better as an architect. So starting off with a skill set that's really applicable, it's very valuable to a place of business, as in, you can produce good material, like the actual drawings and deliverables. That's just the starting point, and it's really important that you don't see that as, well, that's my skill set and that's what I'm good at and that's my career. If you want to be an architect, that's a tiny part of this. And you've still got all of that to learn. So there's nothing harder in a practice than trying to teach all of that to someone who is just interested in one aspect of that. So intellect and attitude are the only 2 things that I'd select graduates on the basis of. I don't, for example, expect graduates to know anything about construction documentation. I don't expect you to know anything about construction. Certainly not contract administration, not really design development. I don't expect you to know anything about building codes, because you're going to spend the next sort of 5 years learning that stuff, and then another 5 years refining it and expanding on it. But the 2 things I can't teach you is how to be really smart and how to have the right attitude. Like, if you don't start with those 2, there's no one can teach them to you.
And as an architect, did you favorite to as an artist or a businessman? Which one is more important in this in the architecture area? It's kind of cheating to say they're both important, isn't it? If I had to pick one,
It's both.
and it sounds like a bit of. It feels like a betrayal to say it, but I think business is more important. It was easy to say, architecture is a pure art, because it's a functional art. It's the highest of the art forms, and therefore it's all about the art. But there are maybe millions, I don't know how many architects there are on the planet, or people who've qualified in architecture. There's no shortage of talent within that. But I've known brilliant designers and fantastic architects who have gone broke. And they didn't go broke because they weren't good designers. And on the flip side of that, I've known, I'm not going to say who, but I've known pretty average architects who are not particularly skilled. They're not great designers. They don't know that much, but they're really good business people, and they tend not to go broke. But your goal as an architect is to deliver good architecture, and you can't do that if you keep going broke. Like if you keep. So the business part is important because without that you don't have the opportunity to get better at your art.
Oh yeah.
Whereas if you're just focused on getting better at your art and you assume that that will result in you being a successful architect, it's not true.
It means good at the business is to provide methods to help you to show your artist and your design.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
So the business in a way has to come first.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that art is not important because
Yeah.
art is the purpose and business is the means.
Yeah.
So the purpose is unimportant if you don't have the means to do it.
Yes. The last question.
No. Just we're so sorry about the overtime.
That's right.
And also, we got lots of questions. If you don't mind.
No, go for it.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you have?
I still have a question. In a project, you still need some business, and for this, how do you run in this money in your project? For example, do you need to separate in different part, or like that?
Yeah. So an architectural fee
Yeah.
is a good way to explain this. I'm going to draw like a really average pie chart. So if that's the total project cost,
Yeah.
like the construction and actually I'll wind this back one step. So that's the whole cost of running the building for the next 75 years. So including the cost of building the building, the electricity, the staff that you're going to put in the building, let's say it's in a hospital or an office building or something, the cost of running the air conditioning and the lights and paying the salaries and the construction is about that much. That much is about how much it takes to run it. If it's a really expensive form of construction, won all these awards, it's in new age materials, it's an opera hall, it's a fancy architectural building, then the construction might cost that much, and the rest is the cost of running the building for the next 75 years or so. Obviously, if it's 500 years, that gets smaller and the rest costs more. So if you just look at the construction cost, and now I assume that is the construction cost, and within that is the design cost, as in the architects, the engineers, and everyone else. The architects and engineers and design is one tiny sliver of the cost of building it. So typically, let's say you're building a $100 million building, all of the design fees that go into it, maybe 5%. Now, it varies depending on the scale. So if it's a $10 million project, it might be 10%. If it's $100 million, it might be 5%. Now, within that, you're also paying for like a lot of like engineering, planning, project management, maybe approvals and fees. So now let's look at that one. Now, let's say it's fairly traditional. Let's say you don't have a project manager, it's a project that can be led by an architect. Then the architect's fees is about that much. And the engineers' fees say that much, the services engineers are that much, and you've got all these miscellaneous things like fees and charges and things that make up the rest. So the architect's doing almost half of that, which is, that's the construction cost, so it's just a tiny sliver in there. The architect's fee as a percentage of the whole overall delivery of a project can range anywhere from if it's, say, a $500 million project, it might be something like 0.5%. It's probably more than that though. Let's say it ranges between 1% and 12%. So a smaller project, higher percentage. So if it's just, you know, one room added on the side of a house, your fee's probably going to be somewhere between 10 and 15%. Whereas if it's a $100 million hospital, your fee's probably going to be somewhere like 2% or 2.5%. So that's your fee as a percentage of all of the designers. That's all of the designers as a proportion to the construction cost, and that's the construction cost as a proportion of the cost of the whole running of the project. So, but to explain the next part, so that's your architectural fee. So no consultants, just you as the architect running the job and your team. So, do you want to have a guess? This would be an interesting study. Do you want to have a guess how much of that is, so we're going to break it down into 4 parts. Actually, no, I'll keep this simple. We'll break it into 3 parts. So, sketch design, design development and documentation, so the construction drawings, and the construction phase, so you're administering the construction contract. We're just going to break it into those 3. What do you reckon as a percentage of your overall fee sketch design is worth?
Maybe 30%.
Anyone else want to take a guess?
Half.
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
No one ever gets this right. So, do you want to take a guess?
80%?
It's 15%.
15.
So that is the design idea. I've drawn that probably slightly smaller, it's probably like that. So that is sketch design. Now, design development is typically another 15, and then there's another 40 for documentation, which takes it to about there. So that much
It's a development.
is documentation and detailed design. And that part is construction phase, which we call contract administration, and that's construction drawings. So construction phase is more than 3 times typically. I've drawn that slide just then. That's about 15%. That's about 30%. And that's about 55%. Did I do that right? Yeah. 6, yeah. So if you consider what is the concept design, sketch design, it's 15% of your fee, which is 30% of the design fee, which is maybe 5% of the construction cost, which is maybe 30% of the overall life of the building cost. That means that the actual idea for your project in the context of the project is worth almost nothing. So it's like a terrifying thought to think, well, that's what university is training you for, is that. And it's going to take you another 10 years to learn that part. And to feel like you're really good at this, the other 85% of your role as an architect. But without this 85%, your idea can't go anywhere. And so if you look at that in terms of, that's your overall fee, you can spend 15% on it. That's not just the idea, that's also the drawings, the animations, the videos, it's everything to get from no idea and your initial relationship with the client to you've got a finished sketch design with a planning approval and all of the material to support it. So the number of architecture firms that manage to actually make money during that phase is pretty slim. Because typically in that phase, what you're trying to do is get the project over the line so that this phase can start.
So the building process is important, and if the designer idea and the image is a different between the result, and how to deal with that.
Do you mean
Yeah, it's a long period to build that, and the first you have the image about the idea and how to how the building like, but in this period it's too long, and the corporation company or some other partner couldn't match on it, so and the result is didn't like the look didn't like you.
What do you want?
Yeah, how do you deal with these things?
It depends a lot on what phase it happens in.
Yeah.
So it's very common for an architect to present an idea to your client and for them not to like it. Like that happens a lot, and it has to happen because the chances of you landing on the exact right answer that they like and suits the problem on your first attempt on a project is very slim. It does happen, but it's pretty rare. You're more often you're going to present an initial concept to a client and they're going to like bits of it, but maybe not the whole. Or there'll be aspects of it they're like, I like it, but I don't want that there. I want that over here, and
only some detail.
Yeah, and the idea is to have that conversation, not to give them a finished answer.
Yeah.
So it tends to be that to get a really good collaborative design relationship happening, you've got to be comfortable showing unfinished ideas to a client, to show them how you're thinking, because it essentially stops you doing weeks and weeks worth of work, and then you present it to them, and then they go, no, I don't want that there, and you may as well tear it up.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go to them with an initial sketch and say, I'm thinking about putting this here, and what about this there, and you make it more of a conversation, then they might say, no, I want that over here, and then it gives you a chance to say, well, before you decide, the reason I thought it should be over here is this, and it's more of a conversation.
Maybe if you have some reason about this problem, you will to ignore. No, you will to announce this problem in your building.
Yeah, if you don't find it sooner, you're going to find it eventually.
Oh yes.
So the goal, I think, of a good architect is not to take the brief and then go away and design and then present that design to the client. If you do that, you're more often than not going to present ideas to the client that are not quite what the client's after. So the goal is really to work with your client to develop their brief together, and then to regularly communicate to them about, here's the direction I'm going. There's a bit of showmanship to it as well, in that, and sort of presentation skills, in that you want to make sure that at the point that you're actually going to reach the conclusion, they are still wowed. Like they still look at what you've done and go, yeah, like isn't that awesome? Rather than just, oh yeah, you still want to give them occasional moments where it's, oh yeah, that's great, but it doesn't have to be one big moment. It can be a series of little moments, because that means that you're very unlikely, if you take that type of approach, to have a client that just says, oh look, I just don't think you've understood what I'm after, I'm going to go talk to someone else. And because, if that happens, then all you've done is this little piece of this, and you don't get the chance to do your job as an architect.
So in that time, maybe it's more like a businessman. it's focused on the successful building process and to finish it.
Well, it's also first focusing on the relationship.
Yeah.
Making sure that it's not just there's the client and there's you as the designer and they tell you what they want, you design it and give it back. Processes like that, there are some professions where that works, like graphic design tends to be a bit more like that, where you give them your brief, they come back with their design and give it back to you. And then it's either, yep, you're hired, or no, you haven't understood, next. But to get to the point where you can just put a finished idea on the table to the client, you're taking a huge gamble that it happens to be the right idea for them. And I just think the more collaborative you can be about it, the more chance you actually have of doing something that even you didn't expect. But it's something bigger and more impressive or more interesting than you could come up with without talking to the client. A lot of clients still do ask you to, now go away, come back in a month's time, and then show me your ideas, because they think that's the way architects should work. But I personally don't think that's the way architects should work.
That's right. Same.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the prospect of the architecture industry in Australia or in other?
Yeah. What do you know so far about the way the architecture profession is changing? Okay, so it's definitely changed during my career, and I know older architects that say it definitely has changed since they were young architects. If you take a really long historical perspective on this, and you look at the role that an architect used to have 1,000 years ago, also, let's say 500 years ago for neatness. So Renaissance architects would spend a lot of time on site, essentially directing the construction. And then it got to the point where the architect is so well educated and so expensive as a resource that he can't spend all his time on that one site. He now has to spend his time on 3 sites, and the client, pays for him to do more. And then it gets to the point where the architect is even more expensive, relative to the trades that are, building the buildings, that he produces drawings and then hands them to someone on site, like an experienced tradesman, like a foreman, and he directs what's happening on site. But it used to be that architects, the word architect meant chief builder. And it's only because, as a profession, to get really good at that, buildings got more complicated, structures and materials got more complicated, you had to know a lot more, it took longer to get there. So by the time you had a skilled, experienced architect, you cannot afford them to be staying on a construction site. But it's still true that spending time on a construction site is what allows an architect to learn really fast. Like during the first years of your career, the more time you can spend going to a construction site, even if you don't understand why you're there, you'll absorb ideas and information while you're there. Literally seeing people put together stud-work walls or plastering walls, watching it happen on the site will teach you a lot. So one of the reasons the profession is changing is that opportunity is diminishing. And I'm not sure that there's a way back from it. So we went from a place hundreds of years ago where architects would spend all of their time on site. If the client wants to come and meet the architect, he comes to site, and the architect there's almost no drawings. The architect is the one saying, okay, I want this archway built with these bricks, here's how I want you to do it. Well, you're more like the foreman, but you're a very educated foreman. Then it gets to the position where you're producing drawings, and you're one step removed, and then it gets to the position where all you're doing is the drawings, and you never get to go to the site. the downside of that is you never get to see, well, what worked, what didn't work, what was difficult to put together, what did they put together but it was really inefficient. Knowing about construction is phenomenally important to an architect. So the reason that opportunity is vanishing is that fewer and fewer projects include this part, the construction phase. So a lot of architects will now do sketch design and they'll continue through to working drawings, but that part is done by the builder, the administration of the construction phase. If it's not done by the builder, it's done by a project manager or a quantity surveyor. It's done by someone other than the architect, which means that the person who did the design, who then worked on the working drawings, didn't really get to see how it was built. And with that piece missing, like if that piece just doesn't exist, you don't really get to follow a project the whole way. So that the next time you do a project, you think, no, last time I designed this like that, it didn't work so well. So this time I'm going to do it a bit differently. And without this piece, you don't get to really learn what happened and what worked well and what didn't work well. And it's a huge part of the learning process. So the fact that most architects, and on still the majority of projects, that you get to do the whole project. But it used to be that it was pretty much every project. Now it's sort of 60 to 70% of the projects. But that phase, because it's so under threat, the fee for that phase is getting squeezed because now you've got to be cheaper than getting a project manager to do it. Which means that the most efficient way to do it is to get an experienced architect who's been an architect for 20 years. He'll run the construction phase. It's just more efficient, but that means that, well, you can't afford the time for a graduate who's really great at graphics to leave their desk and go and spend half a day on a building site. So finding a way in your career to get that experience has a lot to do with demonstrating a real interest in it. It means every project you draw for the first 5 years of your career, you essentially have to tap your boss on the shoulder or put your hand way up in the air and say, would it be okay if I go and see the construction site? Even if it's just a 20-minute visit twice during the project, you will learn stuff, whether you realize it or not. But the more often you can do it, the better. If you're really lucky, you'll get an opportunity earlier in your career to assist someone while they're administering a construction project. And then that'll eventually set you up to administer the construction phase yourself. And by the time you've done that twice, like the amount you learn by providing that part of the service, that will make you so much better at that, is just unbelievable. It's an interesting thing about the registration process in Australia that you cannot register until you have done that yourself. But the opportunities to do that are diminishing.
Yes, thanks.
So, do you know much about the registration process in Australia?
Yeah, last week we had the course about this registration.
Most places on the planet have similar registration processes. Australia's not that different to England or America or.
Yeah, the education is different between these countries. And when I finished my first degree in China and now I study in Australia, I feel it's two different. Yes, it's true. And maybe the language or some idea and some.
What's the main difference?
I think the course is focused on the different things because in China we always focus on the design.
Yeah.
But for this semester we focus on the structure, the technique. So that's not focusing in my degree.
Well, it used to be that if you look back 40 years ago in Australia, architecture wasn't taught by universities, it was taught by technical colleges. And they would spend a lot of time teaching structures and history of architecture and detailing and drawing communication. There were very practical skill sets in there. And if you look at the architects that learnt during that era, they're all really good. And it's because they left university with already pretty good working knowledge of structures and buildings and the nuts and bolts and how things go together, so that when they start off in a company, they're already like learning faster about those things. So what takes an architect now 10 years to accumulate in terms of professional skills, they did in 5. But they did it because universities focused on really practical stuff. Whereas now the universities, now that it's taught by universities instead of technical colleges, it's taught a lot more academically. So it's taught in terms of, we want to think about the idea of design, and you want to think about the concepts and what's your vision and concept, rather than how you're going to get it built. And there's an upside to that it pushes you to think more interestingly. But there's a downside to it in that you tend to leave university without a set of practical skill sets other than graphics. So for example, if someone approached you're in 4th year at the moment. So at the end of next year, if someone approached you and said, okay, $10 million hospital, you're going to be the architect, it's a question of would you feel like you even knew enough about how to put a building together, let alone how to design a cardiac theatre, let alone how to run the meetings with the client, and how do you put together a fee proposal? All of those practical things tend to be taught in really erratic ways now. So I tend to take the view that it's better for universities to either focus on the 15% that is design and just teach you that, and then when you get a professional job, your employer will teach you the other 85%. Or universities should be arming you with enough practical skills that when you leave university, you're so productive that your learning will accelerate, and design you will spend the next 15 years getting good at and better at and becoming a master architect. Very few architects leave university and then do great work straight away. It's usually 20 years away. And I'm of the view that focusing on the 15% and just teaching you design is not necessarily the right way to do it, because you might learn a lot about design now, but then you don't have the skills yet to deliver that building, or in a really practical sense, or to understand why your design can't be built. And that tends to be a bit of a frustration for architecture students. You tend to see students gravitate towards very theoretical ideas and really imaginative stuff, or very practical stuff that's just not that inspiring. Like it's a building, but and university lecturers tend to be very harsh on those students, like, well, you're not being imaginative enough. But not very harsh on the students that, well, yeah, it's really imaginative, but for all sorts of reasons that are too hard to explain in a 10-minute grid, it just can't be built. So I'm not entirely sure which camp I would sit in, but I for some reason think that just focusing on design with little glimpses of working drawings and little glimpses of practical skills is partly what makes it slower for students to accumulate all of this knowledge. But universities worldwide have historically not been very good at teaching construction. I don't know why.
Thank you for your advice.
Maybe we need to learn from the work
Yeah, and
working period.
so all of the contact hours you have in 5 years of study for undergraduate and masters, all of those contact hours that you have with lecturers and tutors is, if you condense that down into actual working time, you will get more contact hours in your first 6 months of professional experience. The question is, are you capable of learning at that pace? If you had all of your 5-year degree, 5-year worth of university packed down into 6 months.
We had 5 year in our first degree. So
That's in China.
yeah, it's a long time.
Okay, so it's probably more than, it's probably like 9 months worth of contact hours.
So when we finish our master courses, it's about 7 years.
Right.
Yeah, it's a long time. And we have, when we finish our first degree, we have an internship. And in China, more architecture company is a big company. So too many people in that company. We couldn't do any about design. Maybe only a point in there.
Yeah, in a bigger company, you're almost invariably going to be, well, you're either just part of the documentation team, or you're part of the visualization team and concept team.
It's a little.
But if you think, just wind the clock forward another 30 years. So you get a role in, and you all get roles in architecture firms, and let's say they're, it's all in the same big company, and one of you gets into the concept design sort of realm within the company and producing ideas and visualizations, and another 2 or 3 of you get into the documentation and construction phase and you learn about buildings, and then maybe one of you gets into the delivery and construction phase support side. If you wind the clock another 30 years forward, who runs the company?
It's
As in, if you're going to promote someone to run the company, where do you take them from? Who has those relationships with the clients?
yeah, basically, who can get more project, who can attract more clients, who have the power to run the company.
Yes, but you can kind of see that over time, if everyone specializes from the outset in each of those, then you spent 30 years doing this, but you still don't know much about how buildings actually go together. If you spent 30 years doing that, you still don't really know, well, how do I form an idea and sell that idea, and how do I get the idea sold?
Yeah.
So each compartment will slowly start to drift away from each other if you don't have one person who understands all of that sitting at the top.
Like the leader to help to keep the team thinking together and the same.
No one knows the whole process.
Yeah.
And no one can run the whole company.
Yeah. So if your job, if your ambitious an architect is to be at the point where you're a lead designer for like a big international company, you're probably a director or a principal. And to get to that point, you have to understand all of that. Which is, I guess, why I'm saying don't spend 10 years on that and then feel frustrated because actually I don't understand the rest of it, or on a piece of this because you're productive in your first 5 years. You're going to have to find your own opportunities to stretch beyond what the narrow job that gets defined for you. And which is why I tend to say graduates tend to be served better in terms of their long-term career if you start at small or medium companies rather than big companies.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
Bye.
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 My pleasure.